The shadows of the botanical world hold a secret, a plant that doesn't wilt under the sun or thirst for a drop of water. While everything else in the nursery submits to its inevitable decay, this one just endures, quietly, patiently, outlasting everything around it. I'm Megan Brame, and on this episode of The History of Plants, we're investigating the story behind Polymeris, the genus that achieved immortality. It's a chronicle of human obsession, our drive to capture nature's essence and lock it into an eternal bloom. And the trail starts, as all of the best mysteries do, somewhere no one thought to look. The genus Polymeris does not begin in any greenhouse or garden. It actually begins the same place most botanical anomalies do, in stone. Fragmentary impressions recovered from Icene-era sediment found in modern-day Sweden suggest that the first Polymeris began as broad-leaved, structurally rigid specimens with an unusual density in the cellular architecture of their leaves, a toughness that, even in fossilized cross-sections, struck early researchers as a deviation from the norm. You see, most plants fossilized because they were accidentally buried and preserved. Polymeris fossilized because nothing, not pressure, time, the slow chemistry of decomp, could break it down. When paleobotanist Dr. Linnea Foe of the University of Mulder first encountered these impressions in the 1970s, she described their cellular structure in her field notes with a single word: stubborn. What she didn't yet know was that stubborn was only the beginning. Unfortunately, the trail goes cold for tens of millions of years. Dr. Foe attributes this to what she calls the Great Dispersal, a period in which Polymeris simply had no reason to make itself known. It was tough to chew, unpleasant to the taste, and offered nothing to the animals and early peoples who might have otherwise helped spread it. So it crept south and east on its own terms, moving along ancient land corridors, acquiring new leaf forms and colors as it traveled, each new population more structurally varied than the last, and yet every single one retaining that same foundational stubbornness. And that stubbornness is exactly what caught the attention of pharaonic priests during Egypt's 18th dynasty, and not because they were excited about it. Let me give you some context. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was seen as divine, with their authority resting on his singular dominion over the threshold between the living world and the next. In the priest's eyes, if a plant that defied death was put in the wrong hands, it could become a plant that defied the pharaoh themselves, and that would be absolute chaos, so they decided to act. At first, the solution was fairly simple: just restrict it. Like the blue lotus, which we've covered before, it was available only to the elite who knew how to be loyal as a privilege of proximity to power. But as time went on, even that became problematic. So, a propaganda campaign was launched to emphasize that Polymeris had no medicinal or spiritual value. Its only power was that it refused to die, and that made it dangerous. As you can imagine, that only drew more attention to it, so the priests escalated. They launched a coordinated campaign to erase it. Not physically, not yet, but culturally. Texts mentioning Polymeris were quietly pulled from circulation. Oral traditions that referenced it were redirected to other plants with more convenient symbolism. But then came the part that tells you everything you need to know about how seriously they took this threat. Because when the cultural erasure still didn't fully hold, the priests stopped writing memos and started moving specimens. Plants were physically removed from the delta, with their original locations deliberately left unrecorded so that no one could trace them back. And when all of that was done, one final cutting was sealed inside the tomb of the pharaoh, whose name was later struck from every surviving inscription. Hieroglyphic inventories on the wall mention it only once as the leaf that endures, yet it was cataloged alongside gold and myrrh, so we know that, despite their fear of its power, the priests still understood it was something of immense value, and that the pharaoh may be able to utilize it on their journey into the next world. And for nearly 2,000 years, its secret was held, until a pressed specimen arrived on a Swedish botanist's desk and blew the whole thing open. Once it was sealed inside the pharaoh's tomb, Polymeris vanished from the historical record so completely that for nearly 2 millennia it left no trace, until 1753, when Swedish naturalist and father of taxonomy Carl Linnaeus received a pressed specimen from a Cairo antiquities dealer who was hoping someone could tell him what he was looking at. Now, Linnaeus wasn't just a plant guy. He developed taxonomy for plants and animals, so he had seen some crazy things in his day. Corpse plants that reeked of death, even praying mantises that looked more like orchids than animals. Yet opening this box to view this potential new plant blew his mind. Even pressed flat in a shadow box, the specimen had retained its color, shape, and strange structural defiance of time. He formally classified the genus as Polymeris in his landmark species Plantrums, adding a single annotation in the margin, Haec una diversa est, Latin for "this one is different." But sadly, his editors later removed that as unbefitting of scientific literature, which honestly feels like a missed opportunity. Word spread quietly through Europe's botanical networks, and within decades, collectors had developed a mild obsession trying to make Polymeris do what they wanted. They fitted specimens with eternal armatures, little internal skeletons essentially, so that stems and petals could be repositioned by hand. They couldn't make it mortal, so they settled for making it obedient. Mary Shelley, who moved in circles where exactly this kind of conversation happened over dinner, was reportedly so unsettled by what she witnessed being done to the genus that she sat down and wrote a cautionary novel about the consequences of tampering with the natural order. You may have heard of it. By 1840, Polymeris had become the ultimate status symbol. A young Queen Victoria received a specimen on her wedding day, and eyewitness accounts record that she wept openly when it bloomed. And then, as tends to happen with things that refuse to die, it just kept spreading. By the 20th century, Polymeris had reached every continent, climate, and living room where its residents needed something green in the corner, but couldn't commit to the responsibility of a more delicate, prissy plant. For decades, Polymeris became a fixture in natural decor, evolving into even more colors and shapes while remaining under the radar of botanists and essentially scorned by plant parents who thought it was, quote, too easy and best left to the black thumbs. But it was in the 21st century that it found its natural paradise. Deep in a vast Scandinavian labyrinth, a businessman saw an opportunity. He quickly collected what specimens he could and decided this new era meant Polymeris needed a new name, Fejka, the undying one. Now, and this may sound completely unrelated, but bear with me. Did you know that my videos have an average view duration of about 9 minutes? Since we're hitting that mark right about now, I feel it's important to say Dr. Linnea Foe, the University of Mulder, the IKEA scene epoch, Polymeris, all of these are completely made up. Fejka doesn't mean the undying one, it's more like to fake. But don't you wish it kind of did? I cannot wait to read the comments from people who didn't make it this far. I hope they're angry because those are always the funniest. But here's the thing, we're only halfway through this episode because the actual history of how humanity spent 4,000 years trying to create a plant that couldn't die, it's just as strange and honestly way more intricate than anything I could have invented. The trail begins, as it so often does, in ancient Egypt, though exactly when is kind of murky. My research turns up dates ranging from 2800 BCE all the way down to 1000 BCE, and without a solid academic source to settle that argument, I'm just going with the ancient and moving on. What we do know is that Egyptian botanical artisans were working in multiple materials at once. The pith of the papyrus plant, that same reed used for paper, rope, baskets, and clothing, was carved and shaped into artificial flowers for ceremonial use. Reed stems formed the structural core of elaborate composite bouquets, and woven right alongside real blooms, archaeologists have found artificial flowers made from copper leaf and colored with wool, sewn directly into funerary collars and tomb offerings. Humanity's first plants were made for the dead. Make of that what you will. Ancient Rome took a different approach. Roman artisans worked extensively in wax, creating incredibly precise floral replicas. Victors in the Roman games received crowns of gold and silver artificial leaves, openly, explicitly artificial, and that was the entire point. A crown of real laurel wilted within a week, but a crown of gold did not. Meanwhile, an entirely separate tradition was developing in China. According to accounts of the Tang Dynasty imperial court, the emperor's favorite concubine, Yang Weifei, had a small scar on her left temple. Every day, palace attendants would pick fresh flowers for her to wear in her hair to draw the eye away from it. It worked beautifully until winter arrived and the fresh flowers disappeared. So an artisan at the imperial court did what any resourceful person does under pressure. They improvised, crafting flowers from silk and wire so the concubine's beauty could remain uninterrupted regardless of the season. The Jinghua or imitation flower craft, was born of a cover-up, and it remained exclusive to the imperial court for centuries. But as trade routes expanded, most notably the Silk Road, the knowledge and the products themselves began moving west. By the 12th century, Italian merchants had adopted this technique and were producing their own versions for royal weddings and religious events. France followed, and by the 14th century, French artisans had refined the craft to the point where their silk flowers were considered the finest in the world. And then the French Revolution scattered those master craftsmen across the continent. As the monarchy fell, the artisans who had served the elite migrated, primarily to England, and brought every technique with them. Within a generation, what had been a closely guarded French luxury was now seeding an industry across Europe and eventually the Americas. There were reportedly artificial flower arrangements at George Washington's inauguration shipped over from France. By the Victorian era, artificial flowers had fully arrived. The Victorians were maximalists in every sense. Silk flowers adorned hats, gowns, handbags, and interior arrangements in equal measure. Craftspeople like the Clerkenwell flower makers in London were introducing new textiles like satin, crepe, gauze, velvet to push the realism even further. Flowers also became a full communication system. Floriography, the language of flowers, assigned coded meanings to specific blooms, allowing Victorians to send messages through arrangements that polite society could never have spoken aloud. The artificial versions of flowers carried the exact same codes. The Industrial Revolution, though, is when we first see a true mass market for artificial plants. For most of human history, fake flowers had been the province of courts, aristocrats, and the very wealthy, handcrafted, labor-intensive, and priced accordingly. Mass production techniques like molding, stamping, and die cutting lowered costs, and artificial greenery began appearing in middle-class homes for the first time. Florists started mixing artificial blooms into real arrangements to hedge against seasonal gaps. The fake plant was finally, officially, for everyone. And then manufacturers stumbled onto what seemed like the perfect material to take it even further. Celluloid, an early form of plastic, could be molded into almost any shape, resisted fading, and cost a fraction of what silk demanded. By the early 20th century, it was everywhere in the artificial flower trade, until it started killing people. Spectacularly, catastrophically flammable, celluloid was responsible for several deadly fires across the artificial flower industry and was eventually banned from import in the US and a number of other countries. So while manufacturers scrambled to find a replacement material, a completely different approach to the permanent plant problem was quietly taking shape in a studio outside Dresden, Germany. In 1886, Harvard botany professor George Lincoln Goodall had a problem. He needed botanically accurate plant models for teaching, and everything available, pressed specimens, papier-mâché, wax, was either flat, faded, or falling apart. Then he came across the marine invertebrate models made by two Czech glass artists, Leopold Blaschka and his son Rudolf. Goodall traveled to Dresden to convince them to get into a new line of work, plants. Leopold was hesitant, though. The marine business model was profitable, and plants were a significant pivot. But he eventually agreed. What followed was one of the most remarkable collaborations in the history of botanical science. Over 50 years, from 1886 to 1936, Leopold and Rudolf produced 4,300 glass models representing 780 plant species, each one life-sized, botanically precise, and permanently in bloom. Rudolf even made a dedicated research trip to the Caribbean and the American South in 1892 just to study plants he couldn't access in Germany. The collection is still on display at Harvard Museum of Natural History and was funded entirely by two Boston women, Mary Lee Ware and her mother Elizabeth, who paid for it out of a personal conviction that it just mattered. I agree. What's crazy about it is that it has never been replicated. To this day, researchers don't fully understand how Leopold and Rudolf achieved some of their techniques because they left no written instructions. But glass, especially glass made in such intricate designs, wouldn't scale. Back in the world of mass production, manufacturers eventually landed on plastic proper, polyethylene and polyvinyl chloride, PVC. It was durable, cheap, moldable into basically any shape, and completely indifferent to sunlight, water, or neglect. Factories, primarily in Asia, developed machinery to stamp out petals and extrude stems on an industrial scale. No 50 years of meticulous craft, no research trips to the Caribbean, just volume. And volume is exactly what happened. Plastic plants went everywhere: offices, waiting rooms, restaurant lobbies, hotel corridors. By the 1990s, they had fully shed whatever prestige they once carried and became something else entirely: furniture, background noise, the visual equivalent of elevator music. Which brings us to the part of the story that's the sobering reality, as is tradition with this series. A real plant, when it dies, returns to the soil. A plastic plant, when it gets thrown out eventually, and they all get thrown out eventually, goes into a landfill where it will sit essentially unchanged for up to 500 years. The same properties that made plastic so appealing in the first place make it a permanent resident in the Earth's crust. The majority of artificial plants are made from PVC, which can contain phthalates and, in some cases, PFAS, a class of compounds researchers have taken to calling the forever chemicals because of their extreme resistance to breaking down in the environment. Studies have linked prolonged exposure to these compounds to endocrine disruption, reproductive issues, and increased cancer risk, though it's worth noting the research on consumer products specifically is still developing. What is well established is that as plastic plants age and degrade, they can shed microplastics into the air around them, and indoor air quality contains significantly higher microplastic concentrations than outdoor air. I'm going to set this to the side now. A 2023 study found hazardous elements, including lead, in recycled plastic plants made from repurposed e-waste, suggesting that budget artificial plant and unknown chemical composition sometimes mean the same thing. We wanted something that wouldn't die. We got something that won't decompose and may quietly be off-gassing in your living room while it sits there looking green and low maintenance. And yet, research has shown that interaction with indoor plants actively suppresses the sympathetic nervous system, the one responsible for your stress response, and lowers blood pressure, producing what one study described as, quote, comfortable, soothed, and natural feelings. Exposure to greenery has been linked to reduced cortisol, improved mood, increased pain tolerance, and reduced symptoms of depression and anxiety during prolonged isolation. We are, it turns out, biologically wired to feel better around plants. The catch is that plants require light, water, attention, and a tolerance for failure. They trigger allergies, die when you travel, and present genuine challenges for anyone with a demanding schedule, a north-facing apartment, or what gardeners charitably call a black thumb. Here's where plastic makes its quiet, unglamorous case. For the people who need the benefits most and are least positioned to keep something alive, plastic closes that gap. Polymeris isn't real, Dr. Linnea Foe isn't real, but the 4,000-year human obsession with keeping beautiful things from dying, that one is very much real. I'm Megan Brame. Thank you for joining me on another episode of The History of Plants. Jump into the commentary episode on Patreon to see what got left out, or if you want to go even deeper into humanity's complicated relationship with plants it couldn't leave alone, check out my episode on Soma, the sacred drink that may have been a plant, may have been a fungus, and absolutely started several arguments that are still going on in the comments section of that video. Until next time, greenies, stay curious and don't forget to flourish.